In 1914, Europe was divided into two heavily armed camps, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. These nations were bound by a rigid web of treaties, all operating under the belief that any modern conflict would be short, glorious, and easily contained. That belief shattered on June 28th. In the city of Sarajevo, a 19-year-old nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Austria-Hungary sent a humiliating ultimatum to Serbia. When it was rejected, the alliance system activated automatically. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia, forcing Germany to mobilize against Russia, which immediately pulled France and Britain into the fold. Diplomacy had failed. Almost overnight, 6 million men were in uniform and marching toward the front lines. This 19th century political system had built a machine of escalation that no single leader could stop. Once the first shot was fired in Sarajevo, the continent was locked into an inescapable path toward total war. Both sides initially relied on grand, sweeping maneuvers. Germany's Schlieffen Plan aimed for a rapid encirclement of French forces, but the offensive stalled just 40 miles outside Paris at the River Marne. This map shows the resulting race to the sea. Both armies tried to outflank each other to the north until they literally ran out of land, creating a continuous 350-mile defensive line stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Generals tried to break this line with traditional cavalry charges and infantry formations, but these 19th century tactics were annihilated by the lethality of machine guns and rapid-fire artillery. The armies were trapped. To survive the metal rain of modern weaponry, millions of men were forced to dig into the earth, cementing a 350-mile geographic deadlock. Daily life in this deadlock was defined by the environment. Soldiers lived in narrow ditches filled with mud, plagued by lice and disease, and exposed to the brutal, freezing conditions of the European winter. The human body offered no protection against mass-produced shrapnel. To mitigate the constant head wounds from falling metal, every major power was forced to issue the first modern steel combat helmets. This photograph shows the industrial scale of the war. Sustaining these landscape-destroying bombardments required a massive logistical chain, turning whole national economies into munitions foundries. The trench network had become a horrific stationary factory floor, an assembly line designed to feed men into a mechanized meat grinder. Stalemated on the surface, militaries turned to chemical engineering. At Ypres, the Germans deployed clouds of lethal chlorine gas, forcing troops into these crude masks to avoid suffocating in their own trenches. At the Somme, the British attempted to mechanize the breakthrough. They introduced the tank, using heavy armor to roll over the barbed wire and machine gun nests that had halted infantry for years. The violence expanded beyond the front lines. German Zeppelins bombed civilian centers, while U-boats targeted passenger liners like the Lusitania to disrupt global supply chains. At Verdun, the objective shifted to pure attrition. German commanders sought to bleed France white, using high-explosive shells to grind down the enemy population, rather than to capture specific territory. Survival now rested on a grim industrial equation. Whichever nation could maintain its manufacturing and its manpower the longest would eventually win. By 1917, the strain of total war broke the Russian Empire. Massive casualties and severe bread shortages triggered a revolution that knocked Russia out of the war and threatened the social order across Europe. Germany launched a final, desperate spring offensive in 1918. They were forced to act. The British naval blockade was effectively starving the German civilian population, and their home front was beginning to collapse. This gamble failed. The offensive was halted by the arrival of the United States, which brought fresh manpower and an industrial capacity that the exhausted Central Powers could not match. The machine had run out of fuel. In November 1918, facing total domestic and military collapse, the Central Powers signed an armistice. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the victors gathered to dismantle the old imperial order. They imposed harsh reparations and a war guilt clause, forcing Germany to accept total responsibility for the conflict. Centuries-old empires vanished. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian states were erased, replaced by a vacuum of power and dozens of new, smaller nations. This map shows the new borders of Europe and the Middle East. These boundaries were carved out by the victorious powers, often ignoring the historical and ethnic realities of the people living there. This shift crippled European dominance. As the old powers counted their dead, the United States and Japan emerged with newfound global influence. Industrializing slaughter on this scale claimed 9.5 million soldiers and 7 million civilians. By concluding the war with heavy reparations and a mandatory war guilt clause, the victors ensured the resulting peace was defined by a lasting resentment that would eventually reignite 20 years later.